Thank you so much for joining us today, Drew.
Thank you, Lynn Marie, for having me.
I really appreciate it. Now, I always start by telling people how I know the guest, and this time, Drew and I are just meeting right now.
Yep.
We were connected through Amy Killen, former podcast guest and all around person I adore. And I had to reach out to Drew because he had this episode on his own podcast called Fit to Fat to Fit, which I'm sure you heard all about in the intro I just gave you guys. That's often not recorded. But at the end of this episode, and in this episode, he shares a lot of things, a lot of events in his life and things he's undergone that many people would be, let's say, embarrassed or ashamed of sharing, or at least, at the very least, it would be difficult for them to share. And as he's wrapping up that episode, he talks about how he dealt with the shame. And I thought I would love to have him on. Be ever so honored if he came on and talked about essentially, as we call everything in quitting terms, quitting shame, which
Yeah.
in all reality is essentially working with shame and reframing it the best as possible because some of these things are completely hard to quit. They are very ingrained in us. So, Drew,
Yeah.
thank you for being here. And if you could take us back, as I heard you discuss on other podcasts, shame for you had been set up at an early age. So, if you could take us back to where that started.
Yeah. A lot of it had to do with the environment I grew up in, and not so much just the environment, but my perception of that environment, right? Because not everybody that grows up in the same environment has that same perception. So my perception of the way that I was raised with the religion and the culture that I was raised in and in my family was one of guilt and shame. And from a very young age, growing up in the Mormon religion, which can be a strict religion for some people, I was taught that certain things are bad, certain things are good, and stay away from the bad stuff. And if you do the bad stuff, then you are bad, right? That was my perception. Either you're perfect or you're a failure. And so that was really hard for me to process as a kid because I didn't have an outlet or someone to talk to about it. All I remember as a kid was, hey, these things are bad. And if you do these things, you have to talk to someone, that's a leader in the church about them because they're serious sins, whether it's sexual sins like pornography, like obviously, growing up as a teenager in the 90s, in America when the internet came out, like, of course I'm going to see pornography, but I didn't know how to deal with it. I knew that it was bad, but it was also this good feeling too, where I'm like, I know this is bad, but I want to look at it. And I didn't know how to process that. I just dealt with it internally, which is the worst thing you can do. And so I felt so disgusted with myself because I knew it was a bad thing. And I tried to stop doing it. But when I had to go confess it, right, to the leader of the church is what you're supposed to do. There's a kind of punishment that comes along with that, and that was, my perception of the punishment was I can't take the sacrament. Now, the way it works in the Mormon church is on Sunday they pass around bread and water, and it's passed to every single person, and people can see who's taking it and who's not if they're looking. And so, me as a teenage boy, I'm like, I don't want my parents, my friends, the bishop that's looking right at me to see that I can't take the sacrament because you're not supposed to take it if you're not worthy. So I was so full of anxiety, and so I just would lie and just take it, pretend like everything was okay. But on the inside, I'm like, you're disgusting, you're a failure, you're not good enough because you have these weaknesses. And I had no one to talk to about these weaknesses. And if I went to the leaders of the church, I would talk to them about it. But I just felt like there was like this punishment that came with it. And so from a very young age, this vicious cycle of not feeling good enough, not feeling like I was perfect, and feeling so ashamed of who I was because I had weaknesses. And that's really where it started. And, a lot of it was my perception of the environment of my family, of not having someone to talk to. My parents, like they didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to go to approach them. So it carried over into married life and in my 20s and 30s until finally I had to hit rock bottom. And that's where things changed for me.
Yeah. Well, let's take it back a bit. When you were that age, you had friends that were also in the Mormon church,
Yes.
male teenagers. Did you even discuss it with them, or was the shame so, I mean, did everybody have this same kind of shame spiral that nobody discussed anything with anyone?
Only the ones that I bonded with that I knew that weren't following the rules like I was, right? I would never go and tell someone that I knew was probably not doing that. I don't know if they were, but I wouldn't feel comfortable going to tell them. But I did have other friends doing the same thing, and that was, I guess, kind of my outlet. But they didn't feel bad about it, or they didn't feel like, oh, I'm so ashamed of myself. It was just like, yeah, this is what guys do, and it really wasn't helpful, to talk to them about it because there was no like, hey, this is what you need to do to get better, and this is how I overcame it. It was like, oh, dude, that was awesome. That's just, like normal teenage boys. So
Yeah, I understand. And with pornography or anything else that people are frequenting and don't want to frequent, whether or not it's an addiction at this point, it's really hard to stop it. Like you said, if you don't feel comfortable enough going to somebody to talk about it,
yeah.
how are you supposed to get any treatment? And so, did the church ever say when you went to them, like, okay, oh, by the way, did you go to them and tell them that you were doing this?
Yeah, I had to go and confess. And after a while, I just stopped doing it because I felt so kind of disgusted with myself, having to confess those sexual sins over and over again. It's like, why can't I just overcome this? Because when it came to sports, that was the other thing. I played sports, was like, hey, you just discipline yourself enough to not make that same mistake, and then you won't make it anymore if you just discipline yourself and punish yourself, and if you will, until you don't do it anymore. And that I tried to do that mentally with myself, just beating myself up more and more and more to hopefully, so it's backwards thinking now, but like to hopefully overcome that weakness is just to discipline and beat yourself up more and more. But that didn't work for me.
Yeah, understandable. You brought up something that I think is the crux of so much of the shame and the issues around it, is that you associated doing something bad with being a bad person.
Yeah, that's what shame is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that takes a lot of first realization and then second unpacking and undoing.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go on to, now you said you hit rock bottom. If you could just tell us a little bit about what went on in that period and how you started to realize the forces that were behind it.
Yeah. So when I got married, I thought all of this would go away, like all these temptations, because I was allowed to have sex finally. After you're married legally, you're allowed to have sex, and so I was like, oh, but that temptation will go away, but it didn't. It still came when I was by myself and bored. Like, okay, what am I going to do? Well, I do what I always did, and so it kept coming back. And I remember when we were dating, right before we got married, she asked me if I looked at pornography, and I kind of said yes. And she was like devastated. She was heartbroken, and I felt disgusted with myself. And so I was like, I can't let her down again. I can't confess to her. So obviously I'm doing it. The best thing to do is just to hide it so that she can live in this pretend world of like, I'm this perfect husband. It's better that way. And I think a lot of men go through that. A lot of men can relate to that. It's better to just live with those feelings of low self-worth and disgust with yourself so that this person that you love won't have to deal with any of that. And I think maybe it's a hero mentality of like, I want to be the hero for them, and I don't want them to see me as a failure ever. And that's what I went through. I hid it from her because that's what I'd always done. And so I just hid it for so long, and it led to more and more things where I would, it led to an affair, which was a big thing, obviously, that I never thought and never imagined I would ever do. I even promised her the day before I left for this work trip. She had a dream or a nightmare that I had cheated on her, and she woke up bawling her eyes out. And she said, I had a dream that you cheated on me. I'm like, I promised her, looked her in the eye, and said, I would never do that to you. I promise, I swear. And then on that trip, the opportunity was presented to me, and I wasn't strong enough, and I had an affair. And so my first reaction was just to pretend it didn't happen, push it down even deeper, and go on as if nothing happened. So I hid it from her for a good year or so, maybe a little bit less, until she finally found out through an email. And it was just like, that's where I hit rock bottom. I was found out, right? I didn't even have the balls to confess to her, right? So she was heartbroken, devastated to the max. That was her worst fear. It came true. And for me, that I just was like, you're a failure. You're nothing. You screwed up big time, and you don't deserve any happiness for the rest of your life. And so, but I wanted to prove to her that I could change. I wanted to change. I did want to change. I remember, back when I was religious, I would pray that I would be able to overcome this weakness all the time. And I was willing to do whatever it took to overcome it. And so I wanted to show her that I could change. And so I went and confessed to the people in the church that you go through a disciplinary process. I went to an addiction recovery program in the church for pornography. And I did whatever it took. We went to counseling to try and fix it. And, things did get better for me personally, where for example, pornography, going to an addiction recovery group of other men, it normalized it for me. These were other dudes just like me that were just, family men that were good-hearted people, but just had this weakness. And it helped to normalize it for me that I saw other people struggling with the same thing. It wasn't just me going through this by myself. And so after a while, things did get better. I still wasn't good at communicating. Like when I did mess up, it was really hard for me to confess everything. Like even the past stuff that had gone in the past. That was one of the parts of the addiction recovery, was to go through everything that you've done and confess all of it to your spouse. And that was so hard. So, but it was
Wow.
freeing for me. I felt so light after that. And so things got better for me where I did start to change. I wasn't going down that path of looking at pornography anymore, but I was always trying to prove to my wife at the time that I was changing. But she didn't believe me. I mean, she didn't I mean, I don't blame her. Like I was saying all the same things to her before. Like, I promise I'm not doing this. I don't do it anymore. And she just, it was hard for her to trust me. The trust was gone. And I was trying to prove to her that I was changing, but it wasn't up to me to decide whether or not she trusts me or not. That's her choice. That's her decision. And so it wasn't until I met this life coach that actually she had booked a session for with me, because she went to her. And this lady named Catherine Dixon here in Salt Lake City, Utah, she was the first human being on this earth to teach me how to learn how to love myself. And it was the first session where I was like, I've never cried so hard in my life, to where I couldn't breathe. Snot was coming out of my nose. And I was like 3 hours of just like a baby. And it was so healing, though. And that's where things started to change for me.
Ooh, there is so much there. Thank you for sharing. I
That
think,
was kind of long.
no, that's brilliant. I'm just writing away here because what I want mainly to get out of this, out of everything in my podcast, is to prove to other people, hey, you are not alone. There are other people who are trying to quit almost everything that you're trying to quit, even if it's a mindset, it's imposter syndrome. And yes, like you said, there are men out there with this, struggling with porn addiction at whatever level, or struggling with affairs or infidelity, and they probably feel very alone, and they're doing the exact same thing that you were, beating themselves up, making themselves feel bad, destroying any chance they had at self-love. And so I really appreciate you reminding people out there that they are not alone in any of these things, essentially. And you said you felt lighter. And I think that's a big thing with shame. And I was going to ask you if you had felt lighter after you did the podcast where you ended up talking about it on your own podcast. But it sounds like the kind of weight started to lift even when you were able to discuss it and get in these recovery groups.
Yeah, and it comes in different phases, right? So it was baby steps where I felt lighter and lighter and lighter with each step that I took, whether it was going to an addiction recovery and getting it out there in the open, or confessing to my wife finally and she knew my struggles, or going to a life coach, or there was baby steps, and then going public with it on my podcast. That was a whole nother step for me, and each of those felt so much lighter to now where I am now is I'm authentically me, and that is the best feeling any person I think can feel in this world, is to live an authentic life, especially as a male, where we're taught for the most part in our society, in our culture, not to be authentic, like just hide those feelings that make you look weak, and you got to do it for the greater good. And that's just what men do. And, I don't agree with that anymore. It's hard. It's really hard, because you have other men, making fun of you or looking down on you because you are authentic. And it's sad to see that kind of environment, but my hope is that can change if we have more dialogues like this and we normalize the stuff that makes us feel ashamed. Then it won't be so bad. Shame has so much more power over us when we keep it quiet. But the more we talk about it, the less power shame has over us.
Absolutely. Have you encountered situations like that where you got some blowback from any sharing that you've done? And if so, how did you deal with whatever feelings came up at that point?
Not to my face. Everyone's really nice to my face when I posted about it on social media. 99% of it was positive. There's obviously, social media. Anytime you post any kind of opinion or anything, you're going to get attacked. But that was a very small amount, to be honest with you. But I've heard through other people, what they thought of me for doing that or being who I used to be, and it doesn't bother me anymore. There's a good book that I read, The Four Agreements. You've probably heard of it. That totally changed my perception of taking things personally and not making assumptions, and living in your own space. And once I could conquer that in my mind, it doesn't bother me what other people say. It really doesn't. It doesn't affect me at all. I know that it's a reflection of themselves, and so I'm good with where I'm at and being authentic. So, yeah.
That's beautiful. I wanted so much to hear that, because if anybody's out there thinking, what happens if I share my story? Or what happens if I shine sunlight on this thing I'm really ashamed of? And the reaction isn't 100% positive. It goes back to what you said, that self-love and realizing that I just because I did bad at some point does not mean I am bad. I am worthy of love, and
Mhm.
whatever they're doing is about them and not about me. I,
Yeah.
I love that very much. Now, I heard somewhere in this episode that in the process, you end up leaving the Mormon church, correct?
Yes. So, a lot of it had to do with the guilt and the shame of being in that type of environment. And like I said, it's not, it was my perception, it was my decision. I think religion is different. It's not for everybody, right? But it is for some people. It worked for me for the time being. But for me, I had to get out of that environment. And a lot of it had to do with the history of it, and I've never really opened up and publicly spoken about why I left the Mormon Church, but a lot of it had to do with the guilt and the shame that I felt from being in that environment. And now I can be me, and I know God's happy with who I am now, versus always trying to please other people, like the leaders of the church, and trying to please who they think God is, and saying you have to be this way for to be accepted. So yeah, for me, I'm still a very spiritual person. I just don't really follow any organized religion, but for me, I can respect it. I can see the good in it. But from just with where I'm at right now, it's not for me.
I understand completely. And this is something I wanted to bring up because that's a big part of your life and your identity when you grow up in a religion, right?
Yes, 100%.
And so, did you have any issues when you tried to leave? I mean, not that you tried to leave and see, like as you were going through the quitting process when you were leaving the Mormon church, were there any fears surrounded, like, is my community still going to be there for me? What about my identity as a former Mormon person? Anything like that?
100%. The Mormon Church and most religions are about community. That's really what it is about: is community of like-minded people coming together with one common goal in mind and working together. That's what religion can do. And so, I knew the mentality of once you leave, it's kind of like, it's not really talked about, but you kind of feel like an outcast. You feel like an outsider. People stop talking to you, neighbors. I wasn't worried too much about that. I was just worried about my family, who I love a lot, and hoping that they would at least try and understand where I was coming from. Like, I wasn't doing it because I was mad or I was angry. I was in a good place emotionally. I was happy, and that's how I left. I didn't leave like bitter and angry and upset like some people do when they leave religion. For me, I wanted them to understand like where I was coming. This was coming from a place of self-love, and I feel like God really led me down this path, right? Even though they might disagree with that and might see things differently and think that I'm lost. I don't really, so I wanted to make sure like my family understood where I was coming from, and that kind of took some time. It didn't happen overnight. It was a hard conversation to have with some of them, but I think at the end of the day, they're happy that I'm happy, and I'm happy for them as well where they're at. And I don't try and change their minds or try and convince them of my ways and my thinking, trying to convert them to my, where I'm at right now. So it was a fear, and I'm talking about this as if it was easy and now it's over, and like it was such a hard thing to navigate during the process.
What helped get you through it? Was it this life coach, among
Uh,
other things?
Partly, yeah, partly. It was also like reading books like The Four Agreements and books by Brene Brown. Because the hard part for me was I was taught that this church that I grew up in was the one true and only church on the face of the earth. So for me, my mentality was, okay, if this isn't true, then what is true? And I'm like, is all of the stories that I've heard, even from the Bible or other religions, are those true? So I had to kind of go on this quest to find out what truth is for me. And I had to realize that my truth might be different than someone else's truth. I wasn't looking for the truth. I think there's truth for every single person that's different for every person. And it just took a lot of self-reflecting, honestly, meditating, being out in nature, reading these books, talking to other people, and figuring out like what felt good to me versus just doing what you're told and don't question anything. That's kind of the mentality I was growing up in. Like, hey, here's the truth. This is the way it is. You don't question it and you accept it. Now it's like, okay, I get to discover what's true for me. And it took a lot of time alone. And like I said, being out in nature and meditating and reading certain books or listening to podcasts really helped me.
Gotcha. Now, when you were going through all of this and you were learning how to love yourself from
Yeah.
this life coach, were there any specific tools that maybe you could pass on that helped worked the shame to the side and the self-love back into center stage?
Yeah, a couple things that she taught me that really resonated with me was she taught me that there's three different types of business. There's God's business, there's other people's business, and there's your business. And anytime you're living in God's business, like, why did this happen to me? Why am I, why do I have to go through this trial? Or you live in other people's business, like, what does this person think about me? Hopefully they like me. Then that's where you find misery and fear, is living in other people's business and God's business. But when you learn to live in your business, that's where you can be happy, right? Because those are the things that you can control. And so that was one of the biggest things. And then what was the other thing she taught me? I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I don't know exactly what she did, but there's something about her giving me permission to just love myself. And no one's ever talked to me like the way she did, right? The concept of self-love for me was not good. It was the bad thing, because then if you're self-love, you're selfish, and we're taught to be selfless in religion. And for the most part, I didn't understand what self-love looked like, and so I learned that from her. And so those were the two things. There's something else that'll come to me later, but let's just keep going.
That's totally cool. So in that, I love that you said that self-love and selfish had been equated at some point, because I think a lot of people make that mistake. And it takes the reframing of, if you aren't doing things for yourself, you can't really be who you need to be for other people. So it's actually more selfish. You're keeping more of yourself, right? If you can't
100%.
fully be your authentic self, they're only getting half of you, or they're getting this false sense of you.
Yeah, you're pouring from an empty cup.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it looks like.
Yeah, I think that's what you were saying with your marriage, is like, I'm trying so hard to protect her from this stuff, so you're just putting this facade out, which ends up being more selfish, because she probably wanted all of you,
100%.
theoretically. Okay. If you could talk a little bit about just taking the addiction piece here. When you brought self-love in, did that help with releasing the addiction, or how did those two have interplay?
100%, because I realized soon after meeting. Oh, this was the other thing that she taught me was I couldn't figure out why I had the affair. Right, I couldn't figure it out. I was happy with her. We had a good marriage. Like, there wasn't any. Not that there ever is a reason, but there wasn't like any like legitimate reason to have an affair. And I couldn't believe that I did it. And so I was searching for answers. Why did I do this? And it came to me meeting with her that it's because I looked at myself as a failure from the very beginning. I saw myself as a failure. And so when you see yourself as a failure, you do failure-like things. And you sabotage yourself thinking, well, I already messed up. I already lie. So why not lie a little bit more? And that's what, looking at yourself as a failure, lack of self-love will do to you. You will sabotage yourself sometimes because you don't have that self-love. And you think, you know what, you deserve this. You deserve this pain and this life, that because you've been a failure from the beginning. And that negative self-talk. Once I learned how to love myself, I could let go of that. And I didn't have the desire to do failure-like things where I sabotaged myself by looking at pornography, because I got to choose, not to do it or to do it, whether it brought me fulfillment or not. Same thing with following, commandments. I just did it either out of fear, right? I don't want to be punished, or, I want to go to heaven. I want this gift or this present. So I want to be good for that, right? So, versus, you know what, I choose to do this because it makes me feel good, and I choose not to do this because it doesn't make me feel good, right? And having that control instead of you controlling or you being controlled by these outside things like pornography or whatever. And so for me, that really helped me. Once I learned how to have that self-love, I was able to overcome. I could see myself more as an observer of my thoughts rather than me just being my thoughts. I was acting upon those thoughts that controlled me versus like sitting back and saying, hey, here's all those thoughts that are going on. I can sit back as an observer and analyze it and say, you know what, this right here is probably not a good idea, and you don't have to follow it. You don't have to be controlled by that anymore. And that's what self-love really taught me how to do.
Ooh, that's really important. And I think meditation that you were mentioning earlier helps with that a lot too, right? The separating and
100%.
and yeah, and seeing your thoughts not as you, as something,
Yes.
especially the negative ones. I frequently do this when I'll have a negative thought. I'll stop and be like, "What? You wouldn't say that to somebody else? Why? Is that helpful to say that to yourself?
Yeah.
Not exactly." Um, I wanted to bring up, so Drew is massive in the fitness industry. And so we're going to put this in fitness terms in case anybody has just tuned in randomly and is like, oh, yay, Drew Manning. And you don't necessarily get what you said, which I think was brilliant, which is once you feel like you're a failure, you start doing failure things. It's kind of
Yeah.
okay, I've already cheated 12 times today. I'm going to keep cheating.
Yep.
Right? Like, okay, I already had a cake for breakfast. Why have kale for lunch, right?
Yeah.
I'm already so if people are wondering like, "Oh, I don't necessarily understand that concept." Just think about how many times you've been like, "Oh, I've already like not exercised and it's Monday, Tuesday. I'm not going to exercise the rest of the week. We'll start, you know." And at least with those generally there's some like start over point. Okay, next week or next day, but in life you get one. And so if you've already decided you're a failure for life, it's probably really hard to without this self-love rebuilding to suddenly stop wanting to do failure type things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great analogy and great segue to tie it into, health and fitness sometimes because it's very similar. There's a parallel between the physical and the spiritual and the emotional. And I try and tell people this all the time. And this is kind of what my brand has evolved into based off these lessons that I've learned is our perception of, like, for example, food, right? We think there's good food and there's bad food. When you eat the bad food, we're bad. We feel guilty. We feel ashamed of like, why can't I just stick to a diet? And a lot of people say to me, I cheated this weekend. I had cake, and I know I shouldn't have done that. It's like, look, you got to change your perception of that, right? You're already punishing yourself once by eating that food, and you're punishing yourself again by feeling guilty and ashamed by it. So get rid of the guilt and shame. Realize that you're going to eat that food, and just do it with intention. What's my intention behind wanting to eat this food, right? And be the observer of your thoughts rather than being controlled by like, I want cake, I want cake, I want cake, right? You turn into this monkey brain and you're not really in control anymore. And so that's why meditation, breathing techniques really help you to be present in the moment to where you can observe those moments before acting upon them. And, let's say you do, have some cake or ice cream. I do that with my girls. Getting rid of the guilt and the shame that comes afterwards is the best thing you can do for you so that you don't continue down that vicious cycle of like hating yourself because you're not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. So let go of that expectation and that mentality. And so once you realize that you have the power to change your perception, you can change your story and you can change your life.
Ooh, that's beautiful. There's our quote for the episode.
There you go.
Note to editor. I love that. I saw another parallel between what you had talked about before and diet and fitness, which was before, if you were making choices, it was based on, okay, I'm not going to look at pornography because the church says not to.
Yes.
And I can imagine people who are trying to get healthier are thinking, okay, I'm not going to have cake because my trainer says not to.
Yes.
As opposed to I am not going to have cake or I am going to have cake based on what I'm feeling would serve me in this moment after observing your thoughts, right?
Yeah.
It's all about the perception of, and think about how much less guilt there is when you say, well, this cake isn't bad because Drew is going to be mad at me for for having quote unquote cheated. This cake is just this cake. And I mean, I did Landmark years and years ago, and I remember like their whole spiel was just like, it is what it is. Like, there's nothing behind it. Nothing is inherently good or bad. Like, even in the diet world, I think I've been finding I'm under eating. And so the things that would be quote unquote bad on other people's diets would probably be helpful to me at this point. And so, I mean, maybe some kinds of like crazy sugar trans fats are never awesome health wise, but maybe they're what your soul needs this minute. And yeah, once or twice, like you said, if you want to live it up with your kids, you have some ice cream, and that is more soul fulfilling than this regimented diet thing that was going on there. There was a second thing that I said, oh, I'm going to definitely write this down. I'm definitely going to remember this. And I didn't. So we're both in that.
That's okay. It's okay.
In the boat. But I just wanted to ask if there were any other like last little tidbits that you have from either training people through diet and exercise or through your own addiction recovery or your shame journey that you think would be helpful to people undergoing any of the above.
Yeah, I love this quote by Tony Robbins. I'll do two quotes, but the first one is, nothing in this life has any meaning except for the meaning that you give it, right? So nothing's inherently bad or good. It's just depending on society and culture and your upbringing and what everyone else, the majority of people, decide is good or bad, right? And so I think, that kind of goes along with what you were saying about like, hey, this doesn't have to be, it is what it is, and it doesn't have to be a bad thing, whether it's, cake or ice cream or treats like that. Same thing with pornography. It doesn't have to be good or a bad thing. It is what you make it out to be. And, for me, the thing with pornography, that this will translate into health and fitness in a little bit, but, I saw it as this forbidden fruit, kind of like in the Garden of Eden, the forbidden fruit, like, you don't touch it, but you desire it, you want it. And that's what it became to me, was this forbidden fruit. Like, I can't have it, but I want it because I can't have it, So, now that I've changed my perception, I can have it whenever I want it. I don't crave it, right? The craving is gone, and that's how I was able to overcome the addiction, was just changing my perception of it and, finding new pathways in my brain to process it differently, to where I could look at it and be like, I see it. It doesn't have any effect on me. It doesn't cause me to do something. Whereas before, if I saw it, the lizard brain would turn on and be like, oh my gosh, I want. And that's what happens with some people with food sometimes is, it's the same process in their brain where they know they shouldn't have it. It becomes this forbidden fruit, and then that makes them crave it more. Well, give yourself permission to eat it whenever you want to, right? If that's what it takes. And so it's hard for people to know how to change their perception of things. It just takes time and takes practice. And, eventually those things that once controlled you won't control you anymore once you realize that you have the power to change that. And so be patient with yourself, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. It does not have to be perfect. I came from that background of having to be perfect or a failure, and just be patient with yourself as you're progressing. And that's the thing, is progress, no matter how small. And, if I could give one piece of advice, that's learn to love yourself where you are now while you're working on the best version of yourself. And I want people to realize that there's more to life than, when it comes to health and fitness, than just being skinny or having a six-pack. We think, oh, if I look that way, like an Instagram model, then I'll be successful. When in reality, that's not true. The other Tony Robbins quote I was going to quote was, success without fulfillment is the ultimate failure, right? So we think of success as like, oh, I'm going to be happy when I have money and I have fame and I have this body. But there's so many people that have that are miserable. So that does not guarantee happiness. So, learn what brings you fulfillment in this life and choose that versus, chasing after the results, thinking that's going to make you happy. You can be happy now with where you're at now. So focus on the process. Let the results be a byproduct of living a good, healthy lifestyle and continually progressing forward in life. There's a word I have tattooed on my forearm. It's Hawaiian, because my dad's part Hawaiian. It's imua, I-M-U-A, imua, which means moving forward, progressing forward in life. And it's a reminder to me to always move forward no matter what good or bad happens.
Ooh, that was so beautiful. Thank you, Drew. I was going to just stop right there. Okay, we're done. But then the very last thing you brought up is so good. Like when I have flashes of guilt or shame about something I did in the past, I have now learned to do what you just said, is remember I was in a certain place, working through a certain thing at that time, progressing, moving forward to where I am now. I cannot, with the knowledge I have now, harshly judge the person I was before I had this knowledge.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think, and our mutual buddy Josh Trent always says, whenever we come across somebody's doing something maybe deemed questionable by us, he'll always say they're doing the best they can.
Yeah.
And I think that's the last thing you said, is be patient with yourself, because right now you're doing the best you can as you're moving forward.
Yeah,
so,
I love it.
Thank you so much for wrapping that up so beautifully and for sharing everything that you shared with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn Marie, for having me on.
Absolutely. Tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, it's super easy. Everything is under one name. It's just fat number two fit. It's my website, my book, my podcast, my social media handles, fit to fat to fit.
I'm going to say, Drew, I didn't tell him this. You have the honor of being the first podcast guest my mom has heard of.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
What'd you say?
Tell your mom thank you.
I will. I will. I was like, I'm going to interview this guy. He got really fat to like learn where his clients are going through. She's like, what's his name? And I was like, are you serious? Like of all the people I've interviewed. So yay, Dr. Oz. But thanks again, Drew. And for everybody else out there, until next time, happy quitting.